What is a player profiler, faithful? It's Matty Kiwoom. Welcome to episode 29. Jeez, 29 of these things. I love it. Of the game plan. This episode, ladies and gents, it's going to be epic. So get ready for a tidal wave of information. My guest is one of the smartest guys in the business, and we're talking about advanced analytics, baby. So, gang, get out your pens and your pads and let's start game planning to win in our dynasty leagues. Planners, my guest for this episode is an integral part of the player profiler operation. He is very intelligent. Matter of fact, he was once called a human calculator. Meanwhile, I'm a human who can basically barely use a calculator. He is the mastermind behind the Breakout Finder, the Injury Finder, our DFS projections, and a ton more. He also can kick a field goal if you need him in a pinch. I'm talking about the director of analytics here at Player Profiler, Mr. Dario Offstein. Dario, what is up, my brother?
What's up? What's up? I mean, happy to be here. Hope you guys are all out there having a good weekend. It's just, I think, is this the first show we've done together? It feels like, I think it is,
I think
but it
so.
just feels like I've been aware of this show for so long. I can't believe it's already only my first appearance.
Yeah, this is our first time collabing on a project, and I got to be honest, I've been excited to have all of my guests on, but having you on, I've been super excited because I'm a guy who loves analytics, but I don't kid myself. I'm not the smartest guy in the room, so I'm kind of learning how to still better utilize analytics, kind of learning what I can use, what I cannot. I've kind of got a good grasp on the baseball analytics, WRC plus, hard hit rate, batted ball rate, all that good stuff. So I'm excited to talk to you today about and more advanced analytics in football and how I can, get a little better in fantasy. But hey, it's our first time together. I think it's gonna feel like we've been doing it for years. That's how the game plan is. It's nice, it's relaxed, and it's everything. But you're over you're on a little vacay, so it's extra special that you joined us today, huh?
Yeah, I guess it's a work from not home situation. I'm
yeah.
visiting some family down in South America in Bogota, Colombia right now. But wherever there's internet, there's Player Profiler and there's work to be done. So that's me right now. This week was a busy one. We're gonna be pumping out so many cool features on Player Profiler this next week or two. Like everyone, you guys better keep your eyes peeled because there's just gonna be stuff flying left and right. So many cool new features that are in the works right now. I mean, I just can't wait to be able to talk about those. But even with what we're going to talk about today, like it's going to be pretty sick.
Oh, yeah. So like we do in the game plan in the offseason, we're doing a little big picture thing. And we're talking about advanced analytics, but then we're going to kind of focus in on certain tools that you can use to take your dynasty gaming to the next level. My man Jeffrey in the chat said he's a game plan virgin. Well, we'll be gentle, but I don't know. This is a good episode to come into because we are going to have a whole boatload of information.
I think he might be referring to me as the game plan virgin.
Oh, maybe he is.
Maybe.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, well, I mean, most people are. I mean, I haven't had any repeat guests yet, so I guess technically everyone is a repeat virgin. So, Jeff, I'm glad you're here. Thank you for tuning in. Hopefully, you're not a virgin. Hopefully, you do this every single week, so getting all that good info. But I do like to surprise my guests with a couple questions actually that weren't in the show sheet. How long have you been playing fantasy football? And go ahead and describe how your fantasy management style is.
Okay, I guess I started playing. I think I was probably in like 6th or 7th grade when I was hopping into like random ESPN free public leagues, that deal back in like, I guess that would have been like 2012, 2013. Maybe had a league with my buddies in high school starting like freshman or sophomore year. And, I've just been obsessed ever since. And then I think my management style, it's funny because, I think I would like to be more active than I am. It's like I spend every second of every day just like running code and stuff to keep the numbers on our site working, that it's like by the time it's like, oh man, let me think about what I need to do on my rosters, it's like I need to go to bed. Like, so I think that I'm a bit more passive at the moment than I would like to be. But I think that, my strategy, at least I believe in, especially in Dynasty, it just comes down to continuing to make sharp trades, accruing value, know your roster, right? Like if you're not a contender, don't kid yourself. and don't lean too hard into the rebuild either. I think a lot of times people will like, oh, I have every pick in the first round. It's like, great, you're not going to go anywhere for the next 3 years either. So there's a delicate balance, but I think self-awareness first and foremost, and just, knowing your roster, know your holes, just things like that.
Know your holes. Quote, clip that. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Know your holes. No, Dario, that's a good point to make. Information is key. We talked about it last week, knowing your league mates, knowing your roster settings, your scoring settings. Know every bit of your league so that you can take advantage of the market that develops around it. But and also, be aware of some of the advanced analytics and stuff like that. So, Dario, keep going. To let people know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what I'm here for. And then I think also, if you guys are tuning into the new Man versus Machine show with myself and Billy Muzio, I'm the machine, in case that wasn't clear. But
the T1000, Dario Offstein.
Yeah, one thing that we really, I think I found myself emphasizing this last episode is like, you don't win championships with consistency, you win championships with upside. So you take those swings. I think that's why Anthony Richardson is, to me, the clear QB1 in this class, for example, for fantasy football, and quite possibly from the NFL perspective too. It's like, you just got to take those swings when you get them. Everyone thought Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes were a bit, out of the box first round picks, and now they're two of the best quarterbacks in the game. So I think you got to take those swings, be it in fantasy or from an NFL front office perspective.
Very good point. I mean, think of just who ranks at the top of dynasty formats. Allen was a project. Mahomes was considered a project. Lamar Jackson was taken at the end of the first round, considered a project. Justin Herbert kind of flew under the radar. Joe Burrow might be the only bona fide, like the 101 in that draft that's in the top 5.
Yeah,
I mean,
Justin Herbert
that way, but still.
Yeah, I remember Justin Herbert when he came out. There was a lot of skepticism. I definitely was not fully on board with him. Everyone was like, oh, this guy's just a big arm. Like his stats at Oregon didn't particularly blow people away. But yeah, it's like he's just complete. It's crazy to think that the only reason he became a starter was because a doctor just punctured Tyrod Taylor's lung. Like, the NFL is wild, man.
Wild. Tyrod Taylor. I mean, he's a professional. He could have held down the quarterback position for 5 games, 4 games, 6 games. Who knows? All of a sudden, the doctor can't get it right, punctures his lung, and it's off to the races for Justin Herbert. So, things can happen. A whole bunch of crazy things can happen. But today we are focusing on using NFL analytics, and how we can utilize them in fantasy football. So the first question, Dario, as we dive on into the absolute deepest end we've ever dove into here in the game plan, what is your general definition of advanced analytics?
So I think this is an interesting question to start off with, because I saw it, and I think that people have this perception of like, oh, it's film versus analytics. You got to be in one side or the other. And like, it's for a long time, it's been the same way. And you talk about the baseball analytics revolution, like the scouts versus the nerds. It's like, it's this whole war almost that it's painted as. But in reality, analytics in some form has been happening for as long as football has been happening. It's about gathering data. It's about what insights you can glean from that data. And I think that, from my approach coming at it from a mathematical background, like, you just have to know kind of the soundness of what you're doing with that data. People talk about one of the biggest misconceptions being, oh, if you run the ball 25 times in a game, you win like 80% of the time, right? I mean, that's been pretty strongly debunked, because obviously you run when you're ahead, but you don't run to win. You pass to win, and then you run to hold on to that win. So things like that, those misconceptions. But I mean, as far back as Bill Walsh was like one of the first ultimate football nerds, and he did, with the data he had at his disposal, enough to make those 49ers into a dynasty. So I think that advanced analytics it's hard to define, because it's anything that is just gathering data and using it to your advantage, whether that's your dynasty league mates, whether that's, yards per carry after contact. There's just so many different ways to think about it.
Yeah, analytics, it doesn't have to be this kind of intimidating phrase. I think a lot of people see that, they hear the word analytics, and they run the other way. They go, I don't want it to do
it's
too
like
much.
They picture some nerd in their mother's basement who's like never seen a woman or watched a football game in their life, and that's just it's not quite that extreme. But
breaking news, you can date women and use analytics to win in football, just so everyone knows. You can do both. They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, it has been disproven. Yeah.
That has been debunked over and over. And a lot of the winning teams in the NFL, they use analytics. They just aren't super public about it. You know, I'm a Patriots guy. I've been in New England my whole life, so I've been front row to watching the dynasty kind of unfold from beginning to end. And Belichick was absolutely in on analytics. Yes, he wasn't the going for on fourth down type of guy, but you know, he was using analytics. He had Ernie Adams that was there to kind of give him information. He just wasn't super public about it. So
yeah,
now that the revolution's kind of taking over, we've seen, you know, kind of the guys who use analytics and excel with them, they've kind of been pushed to the front of the stage for good reason, because it's a smart process, right?
Yeah, I mean, look at the Lions last year, for example, right? I mean, Dan Campbell worked under Sean Payton, who was notoriously aggressive on fourth down. And then the Lions also are, I know for a fact, they're developing their analytics staff. Their offensive coordinator was super sharp, and they were one of the most efficient teams at knowing when to go for fourth downs and taking advantage of their offensive strengths. And that's just awesome to see. And I mean, look at the two teams that were in the Super Bowl. Eagles, one of the most analytically minded organizations in the league. I think they have one of the highest numbers of just analytics staffers, period. And then the Chiefs hired the guy who won the NFL Big Data Bowl, which is a competition that the NFL hosts every year they make tracking data publicly available for this competition. This guy who won it 2 years ago, the Chiefs hired him as an assistant coach, and that particular year it was on like studying defensive back play and how to make your defensive backfield more efficient. And what do you know? The Chiefs are getting amazing defensive back play out of all these rookies. It's like, I think they clearly know what they're doing, and they're not advertising it. They're not going to tell everyone else in the league, oh, hey guys, like,
right,
you know,
here's
we
our
just hired this
it?
guy, and this is why our defense is all good in the backfield all of a sudden. But these things are working behind the scenes. It's like a secretive arms race between the NFL teams. It's really cool to see.
I got a question for you, but before I get to it, I want to hear a little bit from one of our sponsors. So stay tuned.
Hey, it's the Podfather. Now, in the offseason, I get into baseball, I get into basketball, and my preferred platform to play fantasy sports is Rival Fantasy, because Rival Fantasy has challenges where you can just take a guy and say, hey, this guy's going to score more fantasy points than this guy. They put two shortstops together, pick one. Point guards, pick one. Spoiler alert, you should pick Damian Lillard. Or they have the fantasy book where you can pick over, under, and up to 5 guys. And then the more you pick, your potential payout quickly escalates. And finally, I submit a bingo card, because you can just go over, under across the board, get your fantasy bingo card set, submit it. I'm not the biggest basketball or baseball expert, but I have a hell of a lot of fun playing fantasy sports on rivalfantasy.com. And the best part is, with promo code PLAYER, they refund up to $50 of any losses. So the promo code there is PLAYER on rivalfantasy.com. Go have some fun.
So my next question to you, Dario, is should we be targeting players that are on teams or franchises that kind of really kind of lean into the advanced analytics? If you were to have 2 or 3 players in mind in a start, or 2 or 3 players in mind to trade for, should the tiebreaker be which franchises uses analytics? Does that give them more potentials at plays? Do they go for it more? Are they more advanced in how they call plays? Is that something we should be more cognizant of?
I think it's hard to know this early in the offseason. Right? I think this is something where, especially say like week 3, week 4, week 5 of the season, like you really need to be paying attention to who's running their offenses, how, and just trying to pick up on those early signals that a certain offense is being run more efficiently. I mean, I think, for example, the Broncos last season, everyone thought, oh man, they're getting Russ. This is going to be a huge upgrade. Everyone was expecting sort of almost like a Stafford level boost to that whole offense. They totally flamed out. Now they're getting Sean Payton. It's just like there's so many changes happening constantly. I think that, I mean, we already mentioned the Lions. I think that retaining their offensive coordinator, Ben Johnson, was huge. I'm still going to be loving the Lions in fantasy this season. I think that it's hard to say, because a lot of times the analytical front offices, that just applies like very broadly. Like the Eagles, for example, super sharp team, but if you look at their passing, like if you look at their running backs, Miles Sanders wasn't really catching passes last year. He did great, but he certainly didn't quite hit his absolute maximum ceiling season. It's hard to know just how offenses are going to deploy their players, regardless of whether that team is a more analytically sharp team or not. And I think also it's hard for us to know from the outside which teams are particularly the sharpest analytically. I think it kind of like comes to fruition in a lot of things, like who they draft, how they scout. And I don't know how directly that translates to fantasy. I think that that's something, at least for me personally, I don't bring that into my process too much. I just try to look at that team, that player, and look at those, the basic fantasy points, like the stats that I point to try to indicate whether I believe in that offense or not. And, sometimes that coincides with a sharp analytical team, but sometimes it doesn't. I mean, I think there's teams like the Commanders where you can just say, okay, yeah, like they're pretty flawed in just about every aspect. Like maybe we'll fade them all together, but that's just the first one that came to mind. Sorry, right. Commanders fans, if you're out there. But I think it's really hard to paint with a broad brush and say, oh, we want players on teams who are sharper, because it's just not that cut and dry, I think.
But even so, it might not be so obvious, but you mentioned the Chiefs, you mentioned the Eagles, you mentioned the Lions, and all of those teams provide a nice punch of fantasy players, and they use those type of analytics. But I would say on the other side, you do have to be a little careful. Brandon Staley and the I almost said San Diego Chargers, but the Los Angeles Chargers, they're very analytically minded in how they go about their decision making, and they're not as fruitful in fantasy as we kind of want. We want them to be even more so. So I kind of understand what you're saying there, but I think what I'm getting out of this is also follow the personnel. Not just the players, but the personnel on the sidelines, the guys who are making the calls. Ben Johnson, for one. Is there a team, and I'm putting you on the spot here, so if you can say I don't know. You can say I don't know, we'll look it up and we'll post it later. Is there a team that maybe brought on a particular coordinator that you go, aha, this is one of those guys, I need to get some players on this team?
I mean, it's funny because I literally just bagged on the Commanders, but I think Eric Bieniemy, it does give me some optimism that they'll know more so what they're doing on offense. This year, they're still kind of without a quarterback. I think, they're going to give Sam Howell a shot. I think that he deserves that shot, but, he's still, I think he was a 4th or 5th round pick. It's going to be, it might be still pretty ugly in Washington, even with Bieniemy, but I'm trying to think who, I mean, honestly, you mentioned the Chargers already, and them hiring Kellen Moore after the Cowboys fired him. That's probably one of the ones I'm most excited about for their situation, because, I mean, it's funny because you literally just mentioned the Chargers, and I think that the misconception is like, oh yeah, like Brandon Staley, all these 4th downs, all this stuff, but I think that like the way that they were running that offense, they've been near the top of the league in pass attempts the last 2 or 3 seasons, as long as they've had Justin Herbert. So I think that Kellen Moore and his aggression that he's had on that Cowboys offense is going to hopefully bring more of a vertical element to the Chargers. And I think that, I mean, they obviously need a receiver who can stretch a defense vertically. I think, Mike Williams, more of a jump ball guy. Keenan Allen, very much an underneath slot guy. Josh Palmer is not going to burn you. I think hopefully they draft a speedy young receiver in the first. Exactly. But we'll see what happens. But I think that Kellen Moore with the Chargers is probably the number one answer to that question.
Awesome. So I will be breaking a little bit of ties there. And also, the Commanders, they kind of were ancient in their approach. Getting a guy like Bieniemy could take them into the newest century and potentially get more innovative play calling, better, diagnostics in terms of the plays that get guys open. My next question to you, it's a selfish one because I've always looked at it, I've used it, but I don't know if I quite understand it as well as I should. What is EPA?
Okay, this is a good one. I think this is something a lot of fans, it's like it's a random number, right? It just looks like a decimal. You can tell where someone is ranked within the league, but it is kind of a tricky one to unpack. But basically, imagine that every yard line and every situation is assigned a point value of like what the typical outcome should be. So if you're at 1st and goal from the 1 yard line, that's going to be almost 7 points, because 99% of the time that's going to result in a touchdown and an extra point. And if you're at your own 25 yard line and it's 4th and 10, it's probably going to be a negative number. It's probably like negative 1.5, because you're obviously about to punt, and then the resulting drive from the opposing team results in an average of 1.5 points. So that's kind of where the every situation has an expected point value, and then expected points added, EPA, is how much expected points you gained on one play to the next. So if you go from, let's say, 1st and 10 at your own 25-yard line, it's probably like maybe 1.5, 2 points, very typical start of a drive, and you have a 74-yard bomb, gets you to that 1-yard line where the expected points is 6.8, then you added roughly 4.8 points of expected value on that one play. So you take that, you average it out across pass plays, run plays, do it for the defense, do it for the offense, and then you get the expected points per play for the team. And they have all kinds of excuse me. I get so excited about this stuff. But you get then you end up with, like, basically you average that out across every play, and you have a big sample size of every team, and it really just helps you understand, like, how efficient those offenses are being. I mean, EPA per play, like, it's so funny. I have one of my roommates from college always gives me a hard time, but I think I'm still would call myself a Jameis Winston truther, because Jameis, I mean, for all his flaws, he was always near the top of the leaderboard in EPA per play. He was making up for those risks with all those throws that only Jameis would, you just watch those plays. It's like, oh man, only Jameis would have even attempted that throw.
Right.
And once you average it all out, he still comes out pretty good. I remember in fantasy, he was putting up some crazy numbers for us those seasons in Tampa when he was throwing it to Mike Evans. And I still hope that he gets a starting job somewhere, but that's a big tangent from EPA per play. But yeah, I think
it doesn't look like he's going to. He's now wanting to be the backup in New Orleans because he likes to eat them dubs over there in New Orleans, I guess.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, from what I read, he's like still trying to get his health all together, because he's had like 3 major injuries the last 2 seasons. So he's like, I'll chill as a backup, make a couple million, and
easy peasy.
And yeah, we'll see what happens.
Live in New Orleans, which is they're a worse place to live.
Yeah, exactly.
Than New Orleans.
But yeah, I think that's kind of the lowdown on EPA. And then I think that's what makes it so interesting, is you can look at it. Oh, what's this offense's EPA on first down, second down, early pass plays, early run plays, and you can see just like the efficiency of the offense and the defense in so many situations. It's a really good guide for understanding which quarterbacks are the best. It's funny because Jimmy Garoppolo would always come out a little bit high in EPA per play. People wonder why that happens, and it's like, well, Kyle Shanahan is why that happs.
Yes, but he's the GOAT for that type of
but I think that overall, if you guys haven't heard of RBSDM.com, it's like short for running backs don't matter. So it's kind of leading into the whole nerdy thing, but they have the best EPA, just like graphics. You can look for all kinds of charts and filters, look at EPA on a game level, on a season level, offense, defense, quarterbacks. It's a great resource. Ben Baldwin on Twitter is the guy who put that together, and it's pretty remarkable.
So to bring this to fantasy, so I'm looking at a player. Let's just say it's week 7. So the sample size isn't minute. It's substantial. And we're looking at a guy who's top 10 in EPA. But you look up in his production numbers, his counting stats aren't quite there yet. And then you look and you see his opportunity share is a little bit low. All of a sudden you hear a rumor that he's going to get more playing time. He's going to get more reps. That would be your perfect buy candidate, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's tough with running backs to parse out, like, EPA per play is still kind of a team level stat, right? Good quarterbacks can be bogged down. Bad quarterbacks can be brought. I mean, you just mentioned Jimmy. And like, I think especially with running backs, they have even less control over the outcome of the plays where they're given the ball than a quarterback does. Like you can't control the guys blocking in front of you or the scheme. So I think that EPA, applying it purely to running backs is interesting. But I think that the tricky part is you definitely have to look at EPA per carry or EPA per touch, because the overall sort of EPA, it's actually pretty interesting. If you look at the player pages, if you go to like Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley, their total EPA is like super negative. You're like, well, what's up with this? But in reality, that's an outcome that is based on the fact that running the ball is inherently less efficient than throwing the ball. The typical running play has a negative EPA. Mm-hmm. So these guys who lead the league in touches, lead the league in carries, actually accumulate a very large negative EPA. So in a way, I think that those guys who do have a positive EPA in a small sample are guys who I think you want to target in fantasy.
Perfect. So we talked about EPA. I wanted to ask you about another metric. So, or all the metrics. What are some of your favorites, so that you think that fantasy managers should lean on? Like, are some better than others in terms of fantasy success?
Mm-hmm. I think for receivers, this is particularly interesting. I mean, we have this is relatively new. Only starting last season, we charted whether a receiver won their route on every single route. Like, I think, not to bag on reception perception, Matt Harmon does a ton of awesome stuff, but I believe he's one person. He can only chart so many games, right? But we at Player Profiler, we can pay people to chart as many games as we possibly want to chart, and we chart every route for every receiver, and then that's how we generate the route win rate that you see on the receivers player pages. So route win rate for me, I mean, it's a huge new development that we've been working on. It's completely public, very rare that you see something like that. And then we also have like route win rate versus man, win rate versus zone, average target separation versus man and zone. I like to look at things like that. And then a simple one that I think is just like, tried and true, can't go wrong, is yards per route run. Like a guy who is efficient on his yards per route run is probably a good receiver more often than not. If you look at the list of guys who, for example, the best single rookie seasons of yards per route run, it's just loaded with studs. It's like AJ Brown, Odell Beckham, Michael Thomas, Chris Olave last season, and like Garrett Wilson last season. There's just, that to me is like pretty straightforward of an elite stat. And then we take that one step further with formation adjusted yards per route run, which kind of helps you basically remove the bias of how many receivers were there on the field. Because if you think about yards per route run and you're running a route, but you're one of 4 receivers on the field, you're less likely to get the ball than someone who's running all their routes in 2 receiver sets. So formation adjusted yards per route run is just yards per route run normalized for the formations that you were able to be on the field for.
Yeah, yards per route run is one of my favorites as well. It gives you a nice snapshot of who's the truly elite talents. Like if you go to the data analysis tool on playerprofiler.com, which I highly recommend you check out, especially after listening to Dario here, because all that information that he's saying will be fresh in your mind. Go over to and use that data analysis tool on Player Profiler and play around and kind of check out certain things. But when you look at who was the number one qualified receivers in yards per route run, you're talking about the Tyreek Hills, AJ Brown, Stephon Diggs, Jalen Waddle, Justin Jefferson, the stud of the stud. So absolutely love using that. Is there, and then you mentioned the format adjustment, but is there one that maybe people aren't using enough that they should be?
Ooh, I think that's tough. I have to, it's so funny because I process all these stats, but it just kind of, it's like, it's too much for anyone's mind to retain all of it. So I'm just going to pull up, I don't know. Let's look at Kenny Gainwell's player page. Just he's fun.
I like that. I like Kenny Gainwell.
People are excited for him.
Yeah.
Let me see what metrics down there for running backs. I think that, so for example, just like right off the bat, my eyes go to route participation, right? How often is that running back on the field when his team is dropping back for pass plays? Because we all know that targets are supremely more valuable than carries for running backs. I think that breakaway run rate is another one for running back that's pretty useful. Unfortunately for Kenny Gainwell, it was 0 last year, but looking at the number of carries that you're able to get 15 or more yards as a percentage of your total carries, I think this is one that like Tony Pollard has always shined in.
Yes.
And I mean, God, Tony Pollard, I'm so glad he broke out last year. That was awesome to see.
It was vindicated. It was vindication for all the love for Tony Pollard, no doubt.
And then I think the biggest one for me in season is looking at expected fantasy points per game. We have a model that basically looks at every touch that you get, every target, and where it is on the field. And it basically determines the value of those touches. That is all converted into expected fantasy points. And then if you guys are subscribed to the Player Profiler newsletter last year, you guys would have been getting the DFS Dominator newsletter from myself. And in that newsletter every week, I was putting who was due for the most touchdown regression. This is coming straight off of that expected fantasy points, which has a point called expected touchdowns. which of course you can only get in data analysis. Data analysis has way, way, way more stats than you see on the player pages. Like there's so many variations of every stat. And then, so you look at the expected touchdowns and then who's had how many touchdowns. And then you get like sort of who's overperforming or underperforming their touchdown potential. I mean, that led us right to Joe Mixon and his 5 touchdown game. And that expected touchdown model, it just seems like every week I put the top 5 running backs, top 5 receivers in terms of touchdown regression. And it seems like every week, 3 of those 5 guys scored that week. So you really got to be paying attention to the expected touchdowns if you're not already.
I loved using that stat this year, but I think I might have been using it wrong because the way I kind of interpret it, because of I've been playing a lot of fantasy baseball too, so the expected batting averages and the expected stats. When I see someone who has more fantasy points than the expected, I think they look it due for negative regression. But I think we were kind of using it opposite. Is that true? Was I wrong there?
I think it kind of goes both ways. Like guys who are overperforming their expectation are probably doing so because of touchdowns and. They might be a sell high in fantasy, for example.
Okay, so we were kind of locked up.
Clyde Edwards-Helaire, after 3 weeks, was the perfect example of this, right? Like he was crushing, and he had 5 touchdowns the first 3 weeks. But his usage, Pacheco was already getting carries. McKinnon was still seeing snaps. His usage and his expected fantasy points were way lower than his actual fantasy points. That was like the most obvious sell high in the history of fantasy football, perhaps. But that's like. I think, it's it goes both ways. I like to think of the perspective of who's going to get touchdowns that hasn't yet. But I think getting the guys who have overperformed off your roster in a dynasty league, in a seasonal league, is just as important to pay attention to.
So let's tie it back into the fantasy. We're in week 5. There's a receiver or a running back or a tight end. You look at his fantasy points per game, it's 15.2. But you look at his expected fantasy points per game, it's 12.3. And you look, he has 5 touchdowns in those first 5 games. If he is not a superstar, because superstars, they score touchdowns. If he's not a superstar, is that your perfect sell candidate?
Oh, yeah. And if he was a superstar, he probably would be getting enough work that his expected fantasy point total would be higher.
Yeah, right.
You're looking at a fake superstar. Like you're a guy who got lucky the first fake 5 weeks. Maybe.
I like that. Okay. Looking for fake superstars now.
And yeah, absolutely. I think that's a sell high candidate. It's always tricky because you're kind of playing a game where your league mates are also, online. They're aware of the fact that people are saying, oh, sell so-and-so, buy so-and-so. So it's, if it were as easy to sell someone the moment you wanted to, then we'd all be winning our leagues every single year. But I think that, it's just a matter of looking for that opportunity. I remember there's some very influential research, at least in my formation of opinions, by Adam Harstad over on Football Guys. And he basically wrote an article a while back talking about how it's at week 4 is the inflection point where the stats that have happened to date become more predictive than ADP. So for example, if you're looking at a running back who you drafted as like RB25 and he's been just god awful the first 2 weeks of the season, like you should probably still, this is very, very general terms, but if it's only been 2 weeks, ADP is still more predictive of the rest of season outcomes than the performances that have taken place so far. Now, obviously, there's going to be signal in that. There's things like snap share, like they could have just lost their job or whatever. But overall, if some guy is just kind of like still on the field, fluky underperformances, I think week 4 is just kind of, I always keep that in mind. Like if it's week 1, 2, or 3, I'm still kind of looking for guys who are a value. Like for example, the perfect example of this comes to mind. A couple of years ago, it was 2 seasons ago when Mark Andrews just completely lit the world on fire down the stretch.
Right.
The first 2 weeks, he was garbage. I was this close to trading Marvin Jones for him straight up in a seasonal league because Marvin Jones had scored a touchdown in both of those first 2 weeks, and Mark Andrews had just been a total dud. And the other owner just backed off at the last second. And then, the rest of the season played out, and I was just like, damn it, I really should have pressed that guy to get Mark Andrews cheap after week 2. But I think that's, things like that. You just have to be aware of the fact that especially the first couple of weeks, everyone's overreacting. ADP is still more predictive until week 4.
Okay, so that's really, really smart I'm glad you brought that up because all of our listeners keep that in mind next year. I know it's a long ways away till fantasy points become real again before the season kicks off, but give your players 4 weeks. Don't be the guy who sold Jonathan Taylor in 2021 after back-to-back single-digit scoring in week 2 and week 3, because you would have looked like a damn putz, and you probably lost that year because you gave away a superstar. So give them 4 weeks until the statistics, the advanced analytics kind of satirize, kind of become normal, something that we can really sink our teeth into. We're talking about metrics, right, that help us, but are there metrics that folks should be careful of? Maybe they're a little bit misleading in how you interpret them.
I mean, I think first and foremost, just like yards per carry for running backs, right? I mean, I talked about how EPA is a little deceptive. I think people love yards per carry, and I mean, even more so deceptive, I think, is yards per touch. There's this thing in math, it's called Simpson's law, where basically if you're taking an average of two things, but those averages can be biased, then you're going to end up with that second average being like the average of those averages being a little bit misleading. Mm-hmm. Perfect example of this is yards per touch, because yards per touch combines your receptions and your carries, but receptions on average are going to get a lot more yards than carries. So if you have a guy like Chase Edmonds who gets many more receptions per relative to carries than a guy like, I don't know, Deontay Foreman, who basically never catches the ball.
Right.
Chase Edmonds' yards per touch is going to be higher because he's getting those receptions, but yards per touch is just overall a very misleading stat because it biases the receptions and the carries, treats them equally when they're very much not created equally.
So would route participation might be a way to kind of counterbalance yards per touch if they see that route participation for a running back, for example, is maybe an outlier in terms of how much they participate in running routes? Could that be a way for folks to kind of fact check the yards per touch? Because what we want to do is give them the good information, but also ways that they can make it even better and apply it to their fantasy teams.
Right, for sure. I think that, rather than saying, oh, this guy's yards per touch is better than that guy's, so this guy must be better, I would look at both of their route participations. If, guy number one is getting a lot more opportunity to run routes, then like that could be a sign that maybe the yards per touch doesn't matter and you should be looking at other stats. I think it's tricky to unpack all of that because at the same time, we want running backs who are involved in the passing game. But I just think that yards per touch is a bad way of comparing running backs and analyzing who's better than who else. Because, I mean, like, for example, going back to Chase Edmonds, when he was sharing a backfield with James Conner was seeing a lot more carries than Chase Edmonds. Chase Edmonds gets hurt. James Conner eats up all of that receiving value, and he's a league winner. And we've seen Chase Edmonds last year at Miami. We all thought, oh man, he's going to finally get that workload. He's so efficient. He can get those 200 carries and those 100 targets, and he just totally flamed out. They traded him before the end of the season. So I think, paying attention to only yards per touch as a method of comparing who's a better running back is really like, if there's one thing you shouldn't do, it would be that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there are certain metrics that you should probably use to kind of just fact check yourself on those things, like yards per touch, because all of a sudden, like you said, a factor can change, something can swap in their approach as an offense as a whole, and it could take one guy and all of a sudden make him the third down back, and the other guy being more of, your goal line type, up the middle runner type. So that's definitely a good process there. One question I do want to ask, though, are there some common misconceptions about advanced metrics in general that people should be aware of?
I mean, I think aside from the big misconception at the top that like it's this big scary thing that it's just like some nerds came up with in a lab, like I think it all comes from a place of wanting to better understand football, right? Like that's why I do what I do, right? Is like, hey, can we get ahead of fantasy trends and figure out which players are good? Let the people know, and keep this player profiler stat machine running. I mean, you mentioned data analysis. I think I would be remiss if I did not mention the fact that we are like we're this close to a whole new version of data. Like if you guys love data analysis now, we're just like prepare to have your minds blown. That's all I'm going to say. And if you guys aren't Player Profiler subscribers already, or if, I know some people, I think very few do subscribe and try data analysis and it's good, but they wish it did more. it's about to be just like a flamethrower of statistic possibilities. Like you guys, I mean, and anything that your heart could desire in terms of like, improvements to the usability, improvements to like comparing across positions, being able to export as many stats as you want, being able to save the same query and go back and run that exact same report week after week without having to check all the same boxes and knowing and memorizing what your favorite stats are. You could just save that whole report. It's going to be mind blowing. You guys just have to subscribe to data analysis if you haven't already.
One bonus question from the chat. My man, Jason Allwine, is cushion useful for tight ends?
Cushion for tight ends. That's interesting. I think that it's tough because for tight ends, I think we only measure their cushion when they're lined up out wide and there's a cornerback on them. I think that the cushion for a tight end might not be as telling when they're lined up in line. And then the usage, I think that there's just like so many. Tight end is kind of the most interesting position in football in the way that they have to block, catch passes. They're kind of like, I think they probably have to know as much as the quarterback about everything that's going on. So I think that there's just so many variables that go into fantasy usage for a tight end that I don't think you can reduce it to one stat. The biggest one I would look at is, of course, route participation. Just simply, are they running routes when that team is dropping back to pass? Like, I mean, Mike Gesicki, right? Kind of a good example of this. The Dolphins wanted to use him last year more as a blocker. That just wasn't his game. But in his first couple seasons, when he was more productive in fantasy, it was because he was a guy that was basically a slot receiver who was running routes every damn play. So I think that's a big thing I like to look at. And then we also have yards per route run for tight ends. So you can see which tight ends are really efficient on just running routes. Chega Okonkwo last year, absolute stud in yards per route run. He's going to see a bigger role with Austin Hooper out of the way. He's gone to Las Vegas. I mean, obviously there's plenty of Chig hype already, but I think that I'm going to see myself as someone pouring gasoline onto that fire this offseason, maybe.
Get yourself some Chig Okonkwo. So you talked about the data analysis tool and the improvements that are coming. I think that's a perfect segue to the second segment on today's show, using the Breakout Finder and the Injury Finder to win in fantasy. So you are the mastermind behind it. I teased at the top of the show. So tell all of our listeners, what is the Breakout Finder and what is the Injury Finder for those who are not hip?
Yeah, I mean, this is like, these are just two of, I think, the most innovative things happening in the fantasy football industry, period, because basically these are just like simple iOS or Google Play apps that you can go download. It's only $5 and you're just going to get so much more fantasy knowledge at your disposal. The Breakout Finder looks at the incoming class, and basically the way we judge a breakout is if a player either reaches 200 fantasy points, 1,000 yards rushing, or I think it's 1,000 or 800 yards receiving, one of those thresholds. We have a threshold for what is considered a breakout season. And then that probability that is considered their breakout rating is what is the probability of this prospect ever having a breakout season in the NFL. The highest receiver in this class, for example, Jackson Smith-Njigba, I think he's in the high 50s, which is really good. Like, I mean, I think the highest that we have in the database at all is Sammy Watkins. He was like the golden wide receiver prospect back in 2014.
He was. Oh,
Julio
my
Jones
God.
is way up there. But yeah, and anything like running backs, we do have they have a bit of a higher range. Like, I think Bijan Robinson is close to Saquon Barkley's all-time high for the breakout rating. Because, I mean, it's like these guys who are probably going to get first-round draft capital, and then it's just easier to translate touches as running backs into a breakout season, and draft capital translates to touches. I mean, Trent Richardson had a breakout season as a rookie, for crying out loud.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
So
top 5, if I remember correctly.
I think so. Yeah. So that's what the breakout rating does. The Breakout Finder also has other stats that go into the Breakout Finder model. So like, you can look at the components that go into this, like the teammate score, the level of competition, and the dynamic score. These are all different kind of metrics we've come up with that help us find the attributes that make a good receiver. Dynamic score being like, how involved were you on special teams or in the running game when you were a receiver? For running backs, we have something called receiver rating, which is like, how involved were you as a receiver? Because that's very predictive of fantasy breakouts. So There's just so many variables, and you get access to all of this information, only $5, and then it's $5 to unlock the most recent class. So when you download the app, you'll have the entire database up to 2022, and then with a $5 in-app purchase, you unlock the 2023 class, and you'll have all the data at your disposal, and then you can go into your rookie drafts being the most informed out of everyone in your league.
Yes, absolutely love that. $10 to take down your fantasy league seems like chump change. Absolutely worth doing. Now, I think a lot of people listening like, okay, well, I know that Jackson Smith-Njigba and Bijan Robinson are the highlights of the class, but how can they use the Breakout Finder to find those diamonds in the rough?
I mean, I think Isaiah Pacheco last season was a guy that the Breakout Finder kind of sneakily loved. Christian Watson, another one. I mean, Christian Watson was a very polarizing prospect. Breakout Finder absolutely loved his profile. And I mean, I can't give away any secrets in this class. You guys got to go click on the link in the description and go download the app yourself, because I can't give anything away here. But I can tell you that the Breakout Finder model has pretty much crushed year in and year out. I think Tyler Algier was another one that we were kind of the Breakout Finder was higher on than the sort of industry consensus. And, you know, we gave you 1,000 yards breakout season right there as a rookie. So there's just a lot to love from that you can find in the app.
Now, what about the injury finder? How can our listeners use that to better themselves in fantasy?
So the injury finder is on a season to season basis rather than looking at the player's career. And this tells you the probability that they'll miss 2 or more games in that particular season. So, you know, Christian McCaffrey absolutely proved the model wrong last year. I think he had one of the highest injury forecast probabilities.
Yeah.
And that's what happens. That's the nature of probability. But other guys who were way
and he's
an
outlier of outliers.
Yeah.
Like,
other guys,
he's the freak.
Yeah. And some of the other guys who had very high injury probabilities last season were, I don't know, Elijah Mitchell, Raheem Mostert, Rashad Penny. Like these things are, you know, people think of injuries as being completely random, but at the end of the day, if you have, you know, if you're coming back from an ACL injury, like the rest of that leg is going to be a little bit more susceptible to injury. If you're a little bit older and you've had an injury history, that's a bit of a red flag. So this is a model that looks at how many times has that player been tackled over the last 5 seasons? How many times have they been on the injury report? How many times have they missed a game? How severe have those injuries been? Factors all of that in, and then you basically get the fragility rating, which tells you on a per touch basis how injury prone is that player. And, you know, 1 being the least and 10 being the highest. I think Nyheim Hines last year, I was surprised to find that he's basically never gotten hurt. So he had one of the lowest injury ratings. And then that's on a scale of 1 to 10, the fragility rating, which is on like a per touch understanding of how injury prone is this guy. And then the injury probability factors in our projected workloads for those guys. And then it kind of juices you up or down depending on how much you're expected to touch the ball. For example, Deebo Samuel, because he gets so many more carries than other receivers, that raised his injury probability even more than it was already, you know, kind of high because he's had an injury history. But the fact he's getting carries on top of the number of receptions and targets that he sees just kind of jacked up his injury probability ever so slightly. And, you know, he did unfortunately miss a couple of games last season. So it's something that I think it's something you should use as a tiebreaker in cases where you're looking at guys with similar profiles and similar spots in your draft. I wouldn't, you know, have it be the first and only thing I'm thinking about when I'm drafting. Because at the end of the day, like I said, upside wins championships. Christian McCaffrey was, in my opinion, should have been the correct pick at the 101 last season over Jonathan Taylor because of that upside case. What do you know? Taylor gets hurt, McCaffrey stays healthy, and McCaffrey wins people championships. So it's one variable to consider, but I think the model in and of itself did a really good job predicting injuries last season.
Yeah, I think often we think that injuries, like you said, are random and they happen because they're playing such a tough sport, but they're a little bit more predictive than I think anyone really gave credence to. So that injury finder app for in-season decision making, it's fantastic. You talked about it at the top of the segment, but I want to ask you again now. Now that you've gotten everyone's attention, you've lured them in with all the great features of the Breakout Finder and Injury Finder. Where can folks find it?
Yeah, so just, you know, go to the App Store, go to the Google Play Store, Injury Finder, Breakout Finder. It's right there. I think, you know, I believe Matty, you promised you would get the links in the description.
Link will be in the description. Absolutely.
I can't check it right now, but
get to it.
But we'll get people going that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, obviously you're supporting Player Profiler, which is huge. Like everything helps. But also I think we're creating resources that are available at a very user-friendly price that are going to just absolutely change the way you look at fantasy football, whether it be the rookie class or just injury histories. And you can compare in both of these apps, you can compare different players, different prospects, or different, veterans in comparing in the injury model. And there's just so much information that you can get from us here at Player Profiler. Like you said, go to the App Store, go to the Google Play Store, 2 words, Breakout Finder, get ahead of your rookie drafts, and the injury finder data for 2023 will be coming very soon.
Yeah, get ahead. It's easy peasy. You just go to your app store, download it, spend a little bit more money, and all of a sudden now you have this information in your hands that your league mates will not have. Friends, which we all love to do in fantasy. I got to ask you personally, you're the guy behind the scenes, but as a user of these tools, what are your favorite features of the Breakout Finder and Injury Finder?
So my favorite feature of the Injury Finder app by far is when you compare 2 players, you can see a historical trend line of comparing their fragility ratings. So I think this is really interesting for guys like Keenan Allen, for example, who were kind of injury prone early on in their careers. And then you see that trend line kind of just tick down as he has healthy season after healthy season. Obviously last year he got hurt, so that'll probably bounce back up. But I just love that chronological comparison between the 2 players that you get out of the Injury Finder. And then I think in the Breakout Finder, it just has to be all these little alternate variables that go into the model that we give you access to. You can see who had the toughest college competition. You can see who had the best teammates on the field with them. You can look at all these variables that go into the model and kind of create your own understanding for why those guys were particularly, loved by the model or disliked. And I think that there's just so much, like I said, just so much information you can glean from these apps that it's like, how could you not want to do this?
Yeah, like you said, it's easy to get, and the information's fantastic. But that's basically going to wrap up the Breakout Finder Injury Finder usage segment. Dario, thank you so much for coming on the game plan. The information, the sheer volume of information has been tremendous. I'm going to have to go back and rewatch this, re-listen, so I can jot down the notes, because I want to make sure that I'm taking my dynasty to the next level. I'm taking my fantasy game to the next level, using advanced analytics, using the proper tools, all that good stuff. And your homework assignment, ladies and gentlemen, listening to the game plan, is download the Breakout Finder, and soon enough, download the Injury Finder. Use these tools to help you win in fantasy. It's easy. Get them, and you'll actually take your dynasty to the next level. And my final thought for today's show: don't get intimidated by advanced metrics. Dio just did a great job, spent an hour here telling you what you can look for, what to be careful for. It doesn't have to be all film or all analytics. Marry the two together, and then you can get a really, really strong process to help you win in fantasy. So Dario, please tell everyone listening where they can find you on social media and where they can find your content.
Yeah, you can find me at Dario Offstein on Twitter. Just very simple, my first name and my last name. And then I think you'll find my work just all across Player Profiler. Like you said, the seasonal rankings, we're hard at work. We've had seasonal projections up since early, I think it was late February. And we've been ready for this 2023 season just for a month already. And then we've got best ball rankings. We've got FFPC rankings. And then during the season, the seasonal projections. I just had my intern, Evan, analyze the accuracy of our week-to-week season, in-season projections. And they did a pretty good job, I'll say. I think if you guys are not subscribed and using our weekly rankings and our DFS tools, you guys are missing out, because there's definitely a very significant edge to be gained. I know for a fact that Aaron Stewart, our head of social media, he was leveraging our projections against Prediction Strike's projections and just raking in the dough on Prediction Strike. So there's just so much that you can find over at Player Profiler. And like I said, follow me at Twitter at Dario Offstein. And that's about it for me.
Dario, thank you so much for coming on the game plan. The information you brought to the table was second to none. And like I said, I'm going to have to go back and re-listen to make sure I got all the nooks and crannies and I understand everything that you brought. But that's going to put a bow on episode 29. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to the Player Profiler YouTube channel. Follow me on Twitter. I'm at Matty Kiwoom. And make sure you're following the Player Profiler TikTok accounts at Player Profiler and Profiler_NFL because we got videos coming out all day, every day. And if you love fantasy football, be sure to join the Player Profiler Discord channel where me, Dario, and other members of the underworld are talking fantasy 24/7. So keep on game planning, my friends, and I will talk to you next week. Peace.
Hey, you like that video? Be sure to subscribe and activate those alerts so you get notified as soon as new videos drop. And be sure to check out playerprofiler.com. We have all the tools for you to dominate every type of fantasy league. We have a draft kit, Dynasty Deluxe, data analysis, DFS Dominator, and don't forget the player rankings to rule them all.